this episode, Dude and JD interview Pat Heist from Wilderness Trail to discuss their story while we drink through some of their offerings. Tune in to hear what we thought on this episode of The Bourbon Hunters. Have you thought about supporting our podcast? Head on over to www.bourbonhunters.com where you can by purchasing Bourbon Hunters products and sign up for our Patreon, which includes exclusive access to single barrel announcements from our private barrel club. Thank you for taking time out every day to join us on our hunt for great bourbon. Reward yourself and sit back, grab a pour, kick up your feet, and enjoy. Welcome to another episode of the Bourbon Hunters. I am Dude Poole, and I am joined by
JD Fridges.
All right, and we've got Pat Heist from Wilderness Trail with us today. Pat, if you'd like to go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yep, my name's Dr. Patrick Heist of Wilderness Trail Distillery. If anybody's got any medical emergencies, go find a real doctor. I have a PhD. So, any agricultural questions, though, I'm happy to help.
That's funny. I have a friend of mine who is a PhD as well. She always says she's a doctor, and I'm like, but still call an ambulance. And so that's funny that you said that. That's good. So let's talk about some Wilderness Trail. I'm pretty excited here. I've got a few things here. I've got the wheated, the standard rye bourbon, both the bottled and bonds there. And then, but before we get started, I'd like to dig in a little bit. I know you originally went to University of Kentucky, right? And tell us how you got into this industry. I really like this story.
Yeah, I not only originally went to University of Kentucky, but I went there the whole damn trip. I went there bachelor's, master's, and PhD, so it wasn't just a part-time thing there. So starting off as a very confused individual that didn't really know what he wanted to do, I started college back in 1990, and like a lot of college kids, you know, not really knowing what you want to do, I started off in, I picked something, and that something for me was pre-medicine. And by year two, I kind of was having reservations about the whole doctor thing, mainly reservations about whether I was going to be able to cut the mustard. And I took microbiology for the first time, and I just really loved it. And so I just, fell in love with that subject, and I changed my major to microbiology, got a microbiology degree, and then went on to get a master's degree and a PhD in plant pathology, which is the study of how microorganisms affect field crops and plants of different, if you have a greenhouse operation, you've got a big, a leaf fungus that takes over on your flowers, you call on a plant pathologist to help out figure what's going on. If you're a farmer growing soybeans or corn or wheat and you've got, a virus or a fungus or, could be a bacteria, plant pathology is where that also would kind of get solved. So here I was with a PhD in agriculture and still really hadn't figured. I really enjoyed the subject of plant pathology. But as you can imagine, there just aren't too many jobs available in that discipline. So when you look around the world at any given time, there might be 2 or 3 plant pathology jobs open. So I really kind of went back to the heart of what was my interest, and that was microbiology. And I ended up getting a job as a medical microbiology professor at Pikeville College in Eastern Kentucky. They have a really excellent medical school there. It's an osteopathic medical school, and I started there in 2003 as a medical microbiology professor. And one thing about being in Pikeville, Kentucky, which is as far Eastern Kentucky as you can go, I thought I was from Eastern Kentucky. But from where I grew up, you can still go another 150 miles east and still be in Kentucky. So that's real Eastern Kentucky. That's where the Hatfields and the McCoys, and all
it's
that
close
stuff.
Enough to smell West Virginia, right?
Yeah, you're right there.
Now I can say that because both my parents are from West Virginia, so I can say that.
Okay, yeah, you know where it's at. Yeah. So over in that area, as you well know, there's a lot of moonshining going on, and that was also an interesting time in history for things like, I think that's when the Moonshiners came on Discovery Channel, and there was just a lot of interest around distilled spirits. And so I didn't have to look much further than I was actually playing in a rock band at that time as well, as if the plot couldn't get any more thicker. So my business partner, my current business partner in Wilderness Trail, started off as a guitar player in my band, or is our band, I'll say. So Shane Baker, we knew each other back from the college days, and we had a band, and kind of having distilled spirits in mind and some other opportunities, we got together. He's a mechanical engineer. I'm a microbiologist. And we put our heads together back in 2000, and would have been about 2005, 2006. And we started a company that markets fermentation products to distilleries and breweries. And we started off in fuel alcohol, mainly. A lot of people don't realize, but in North America and in Ohio, where you guys are, you may or may not have noticed the fuel ethanol distilleries that are located there. Poet is a big company that does that there. There's one, a Guardian Ethanol in Lima, Ohio. That's another one, Lima. I don't know how you say it. I've been there a whole bunch of times, though. So anyway, we started off serving fuel ethanol distilleries. And little by little, we got over into beverage alcohol. And one thing about being a yeast supplier is the yeast gets the blame for every problem that a distillery or a brewery has. So half the time, if our customers were having issues, they would call us, and then we would go to the facility and help them figure out what the problem was. And 9 times out of 10, it didn't have anything to do with the yeast. It's just that the fermenter's not bubbling right. It must be something yeast related. So you're the one that gets the phone call. So after we had been in and out of hundreds of distilleries helping solve issues, and grew that company, Firm Solutions, to, currently today that we have dozens of employees. We serve hundreds of different distilleries and breweries. So that's something that still continues to this day. And we just got really good at all the details about breweries and distilleries. What caused the problems? What were the things that worked out really well? And when you look, if you work at Maker's Mark, for example, they're not going to let you just walk in the door over at Heaven Hill and walk through the process. But as yeast suppliers, we were able to really get in and out of a lot of different distilleries and breweries and learn a lot. And that's what led up to us having the confidence as well as the capital to start Wilderness Trail Distillery, which was we started distilling in 2013.
Now, when you first got into, the Firm Solutions, which I love the name, by the way, the FERM. That's great. So when you first got into that, was it always the goal to eventually start distilling yourselves, or was that just something that as you were doing this consulting or this, science behind the bourbon type of thing, that it just grew and became an itch that you had to scratch?
Well, going back even before Firm Solutions, Shane and I are a couple of the biggest bourbon fanatics on the planet. So, I don't know that it was as much of a plan as it was a dream. Everybody who drinks bourbon, it's in the back of your head, golly, what if I had a bourbon distillery? Wouldn't that be cool? And all the cool things that you can do to manipulate and then with our know-how and plus our passion for the spirit category, we just had to do it, really.
That makes sense. So just a natural evolution to fulfill that dream that you had. That's pretty cool. So I know that I've followed you guys for a while. From the early days, I know one of the things that always intrigued me, sweet mash versus, sour mash. Do you want to talk a little bit about how you made that decision and which way to go on that one?
Yep. So, when you enter I guess that you could say that was a crowded category, and definitely has gotten more so since then. But anytime you enter a category which there's a lot of well-established brands, you want to figure out, how am I going to differentiate myself from everyone else? And one thing about sweet mash production, whenever you talk to a lot of the master distillers, they say, oh, we did that once. And, every distillery does sweet mash production sometimes, because when you start up fresh, you don't have back set. So you have to do a couple batches of sweet mash before you're recycling, leftover thin stillage to create a sour mash. So we wanted to do that because it was kind of thought of as being very difficult to achieve. And a lot of what makes it difficult, especially when you consider the heritage distilleries, like, any of the heritage distilleries, ones that been around for a long time, they've got age-old processes. Some of them's got wooden fermenters dating back to over 100 years. So they've got a lot of background bacterial contamination. And for that reason, you almost have to run a sour mash. And again, sour mash is when you're mixing the grains with the hot water at the beginning of the process to make the mash. In a sour mash process, you're displacing about 20 to 30% of that mashing water with liquid left over or filtered out of a previous distillation. So that liquid has been through fermentation and it's acidic. And when you acidify the mash, you make it less susceptible to contamination from bacteria. And if you're running an old distillery and you've got high bacterial pressure every day, it behooves you to run a sour mash process, keep that pH low, and you'll have less problems. And that's the reason why those distilleries say, hey, it makes our process more consistent, because they have less problems with bacterial contamination. But where Shane and I built that facility just recently, with a lot of know-how from distilleries of how did they get contaminated, we were able to build our process to where we're able to clean it in such a perfect way that we didn't have that background bacterial pressure. And so we were able to confidently run a sweet mash, which is simply mixing all the fresh grains with fresh water each time and not adding any back set. We were able to accomplish that. And there are some things about that. I mean, there weren't really too many precedences. Where do you go buy a bottle of sweet mash, or where could you buy a bottle 10 years ago? Right. Now there's several options, but there wasn't much of a precedent. So there was a little bit of a risk to it. Like, is there gonna be something about it that's really different? But the differences actually ended up being really positive things, like mouthfeel, pH, the acidity of the beverage. I don't know if you've noticed, especially with the cask strength offerings, they don't drink like 114 or 118 proof. They drink like a lot lower proof. Yeah. And I think a lot of that is due to the difference of the acidity of the distillate, which is a reflection of the acidity of our mash. It starts higher, it ends higher. Our distillate is a higher pH than the distillate of a sour mash producer. And so it comes off differently in the mouthfeel.
So I just heard a ton of words, and the thing I took from that is that you selected it because it was perceived as tougher. So
that's the take-home message.
So I like that. I like that direction. Just do it because it sounds harder. So that's right. So we're about 20 minutes or so into this, and I'd like to get a little bit of bourbon in me. So let's introduce a little bit into the wheated bottled and bond. This batch number is LG10A. So if you want to talk about how you name the batches, and then just kind of introduce us to the wheated. If I don't know if you publish the mash bill or not, I didn't look at that.
Yep. Now that mash recipe, it's probably not on the side of the bottle, but the mash recipe is 64% wheat, 64% corn rather, 24% wheat, and 12% malted barley. So that 64-24-12 recipe is the standard recipe for our bourbon. And in the case of the black label high rye bourbon, we're just simply swapping out that 24% wheat with 24% rye. So the wheated bourbon has, some things about it besides the sweet mash is we have much lower percentage of corn, 64% versus, most of the brands out there have over 70% corn.
And it's a pretty decent percentage of malted barley too. How long did it take you to settle in on that percentage? Was there any reasoning for that number? Did you do some, give and take, some testing, just a process of elimination, or?
Yeah, actually, in addition to us just being big bourbon fans, and, we kind of modeled, hey, what kind of bourbon do we want to make? We want to make it like the ones that we like. So what did we like? Wheated bourbons have always been big on our list, and Shane, his family's actually got a robust history I can say my great grandfather worked at what is now MGP. It would have been Seagram's back in the old days. But Shane's family, actually, his grandmother, just one example of some cool stuff that went on in his family, distilling related. His grandmother was employed by the Kentucky River Distillery, called Kentucky River Distilling, which went on to be, let's see, what the heck's the name? Canada Dry. And then later she ended up at Stitzel-Weller Distillery, and that's where she met her future husband, who was a security guard. So Shane's grandfather worked there, and his grandmother worked at Stitzel-Weller as well. And we had some old archival paperwork and some different things about some different mash recipes that they had done there, as well as just some research that we had done, looking at kind of, what did the wheated recipes look like back in the 50s and the 60s, and they had less corn. So that was kind of one thing that we looked at.
So there probably wasn't a lot to choose from back in the 50s and 60s, right? Just the Stitzel-Weller, Maker's Mark, and is that about it? Or what else was there?
Well, I mean, the list could get extensive, but Stitzel-Weller had the ones that I know to be famous, like Weller, Old Fitzgerald, the Pappy series, those types of, and then of course you got later on, you got Maker's Mark, and now there's a lot of different ones. Right. But yeah, those are kind of some of the classic ones. Weller and Pappy, those were always kind of, especially going back to when it was made at Stitzel-Weller.
Right. So that's interesting. So I've already kind of had a little bit here, but I'm going to let Mr. JD give a little tasting note and nosing note. He's been awfully quiet, so give him a chance to shine here. So buckle up. This is where you get the memories of grandparents and things like that somehow.
No, I've really been just kind of nerding out on all of those terminology items that dude isn't picking up on. I went to Rutgers for agronomy, and so I can pick up on a lot of that. I wanted to ask you, Dr. Heist, what's your favorite disease?
Favorite disease, plant or human? Because I've been involved with both. Plant. My favorite disease is downy mildew of tobacco, otherwise known as blue mold. That's the one that I studied most intensively for my master's and PhD. Although nowadays we do a lot of work with mycotoxins, as they can contaminate grains. It's like a fungal toxin that we measure at distilleries to make sure that we're not getting that stuff into our process. And I talk to a lot of distilleries about that on a regular basis. So that's another kind of one high up on the list.
So that was going to lead me to a question real quick, and sorry, JD, to not let you tell your tasting notes, but how often are you still doing that kind of consultative, I guess, plant pathology type approach for other distilleries?
I mean, it can be daily a lot of times. I'm kind of, Firm Solutions, like any well-seasoned company, and Wilderness Trail is another good example of, we've got incredible teams in place at both of those places. So Shane and I aren't there pulling the levers anymore. The factories are kind of running themselves. And so, that frees me up to kind of get into more, high-level speaking engagements and different things. But I still do a lot of not only speaking about it, but also, day to day. I just got off the phone probably 30 minutes before this interview started with a distillery about a problem related to grain quality. So, I'm still in the game pretty regularly.
So I'm glad that we've been able to elevate your conversation after that, which was probably not a very, good conversation before. So here's
boring. Yeah, it was
exactly.
Pretty simple.
Exactly. So I'm going to jump back into the whiskey here, but I really like this. For me, I got a little bit of a crisp on the nose. I know that's not exactly, but I got like a crispness and some floral notes to it. I think, the corn's present, but it's not like, some youthful type of nose or anything like that, but it's just kind of there reminding you that you're drinking whiskey. But yeah, on the taste, I get a really nice, clean mouthfeel, but it has a good viscosity to it still. A lot of times I feel like when I get that clean or crisp mouthfeel, it just kind of goes in and dies away. This doesn't seem to do that. So it does linger in a good way. And it has a nice finish too, as well. I'm not 100% sure I can pinpoint the tasting notes yet, which is why I was trying to hand it off to JD to get some grandmother making sweet corn biscuits when he was 2 years old. And go ahead, JD.
All right. So I'm getting almost like a loaf of bread with like orange zest that's been baked into it.
Yeah, that's what I was talking about right there.
I'm getting a nose on the palate. And on the palate, it doesn't have an overly oily feeling on the tongue. It kind of just flows over the top of it, gives you that pop rock candy kind of feeling where it kind of tingles a little bit, and that sweetness just elevates as it moves to the back of the finish. It's really pleasant.
Yeah, I agree. Pleasant's a good word. I think this is something I could sit with for a whole evening. It's, it just has a nice, pleasant. That's probably the best way to describe it. But I figured cornbread type of, something about that would come through, because I was getting something like that, but I couldn't really pinpoint. But cornbread is a good way to describe that. I like that. What, Pat, when you drink this, or if you still, drink the 100 proof, I don't know if you go and do like the old Greg Metz, taking it down to like 40 proof to taste it and test it. But what do you generally get when you drink the wheated?
Well, when we're in the lab, we're definitely doing the 40 proof Metz method. But, normally I'm either cask strength or the bottle in bond. But, one thing that, the product that you're drinking there is only about 4.5 years old. So I think something that is worth mentioning here is the complexity that we're able to achieve at that younger age. And it just keeps getting better. I mean, I know you got a 6-year there. We've released 8-year. We've just actually, the oldest whiskey we've ever released was a 10-year. We did a release recently of a 10-year. And, if it tastes that complex at 4 years, you can only expect better things, as it gets older. And so even like the floral notes that you mentioned, that's kind of getting into some pretty complex esters. Yeah. And so for that to have occurred at such a young age on a wheated bourbon, especially where you don't have that rye, kind of spicing up the scene, so those are kind of a couple comments. I think with our whiskeys, you're always going to get those classic caramel and vanilla notes, like you would expect in that type of whiskey. But then the mouthfeel is a lot of people talk about creaminess whenever they taste our wheated bourbon. So that's kind of another adjective that comes in sometimes, kind of creaminess, which is a little bit of a mouthfeel. I hear that a lot when I'm teaching classes and I'm asking, hey, what does corn do to the distillate? Everybody says, oh, that's sweet. It's like, okay, yeah. What about wheat? Or what about rye? It's like, oh, that's spicy. It's what about wheat? And you start getting into words like related more to mouthfeel and creaminess, and so those are just some kind of things that I would echo with this particular product.
Yeah, it's actually interesting that you say, that 4-year range, especially for, obviously it has to be at least 4 years for the bottled and bond, but for a wheated to taste that complex at 4 years, because it generally takes a little bit longer in that maturation. That's really nice for, being in that 4-year range. That's good.
Yeah, just want to point that out as well. Now, where are you guys located in Ohio? Just to flip the conversation.
Oh, no problem. Yeah, Columbus area. JD is a little bit in between Columbus and Cincinnati, but closer to Columbus. But yeah, we're in the Columbus area.
Okay, I got some relatives that big Ohio State fans. Actually, they were able to score me tickets to the first rock show that was ever held at the Horseshoe there.
Is that Pink Floyd?
Pink Floyd, yep.
Yeah, I didn't go to that. I'm still kicking myself. I remember everyone got tickets to that, and at the time, like the prices were outrageous. Now, not so. It seems pretty tame. But
they were probably like $30.
No, I think they were like $100, and it was like the first concert I'd ever seen that were like $100 tickets. But now that same concert would be $400 or $500, I'm sure.
Oh gosh, yeah. There were 78,000 people there, if I recall, and we were in probably seat number 78,000. Like, at the end of Comfortably Numb, we're still hearing the beginning of The Wall.
That's funny.
It's really
it's they pack them in there. I've been there for a couple of pretty good concerts, but that's one I'm still kind of kicking myself about. So yeah.
Just had to mention that Ohio moment there.
No, that's great. That's a great. That's funny that that's a concert that you went to, because I still kick myself for not going to that one. So let's talk a little bit about you started off, I would say. And this is going to be a question, I think, but, as a craft distillery, you guys had, I feel like, really good success as a craft distillery. And would you still consider yourself a craft distillery? I know that, you have, Campari, when did that happen? The
that was end of 2022.
2022. So, I know that doesn't necessarily, just because of that, make you not a craft distillery, but would you consider yourself, with the amount, what do you have, over 100,000 barrels still resting with your distillate right now?
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah, more like 300,000.
Yeah, okay.
Wow. So, starting off, we definitely embraced the term craft. And since then, the term has been bashed around and put through the dryer a few times. And there have been a lot of distilleries that just could never get past the, what it takes to, get to a 4 to 6 year product. And a lot of distilleries died at 2 to 3 years old, and they never had anything older than that, and kind of got bad reputation. Yes. Either it was trying to sell stuff that wasn't aged properly, or putting out stuff that wasn't that great because you had to. I mean, there's just different reasons why different distilleries failed. But the craft name kind of got a little tarnished, I think, because of some of the people who got into the business without really having their ducks in a row, Right. But I've always considered us to be artisan. When I think of that, what does craft really mean? Handcrafted. I think it's something that is artisanally manufactured, and we've always really, even though we're a huge distillery today, we still adapted all of the same practices that we had when we first started. I mean, we've always used mechanical agitation. We've never been like stirring and mash with our hands or anything. So, we've always had, mechanical intervention in every step of the process. But we've always done things stripped it all back to the bare essence and then kind of built it up to what we believe to be the perfect process. I mean, that's really our goal all along, has been use our knowledge base, which according to my math has never been seen in the history of mankind, because like I said, you're just not allowed to go into multiple distilleries, and we're going down underneath the fermenters to see how the agitators are working, and of course we need to know what the mash recipe is. Of course we need to, and when we're culturing bacteria out of the fermenters, and I mean, it gets pretty deep, and we've done that with hundreds of distilleries. And just having that know-how and going into it just puts you in a whole different position to create something quality. And so, yeah, I would consider us to have started off craft, but I think we're artisan producers, but we've definitely blown way out of the craft category.
I would agree with that. And so I think something you just said kind of takes me to another question. So the fact that you've been behind the curtain, if you will, seeing the wizard, pulling the levers, all that stuff. When you decided to get into the game of distilling your own, distillate, was there any pushback from people that knew you had seen behind the scenes of their operations? Was there any animosity or any type of ill will or any bad juju, if you will, based off of you guys having that type of insider information? And insider's not the right word, but you know what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, we're really good friends with all of our customers, all the people in the bourbon industry, all the people in fuel, ethanol, beer, all the way to the hard seltzer folks that just came along recently. And outside of a smart ass comment here and there, just from somebody who's like your buddy trying to give you a hard time, we never really had any problems. And in fact, we were doing things like, we have a stillage filtration system that's kind of a one of a kind unit. It just is an example of some innovation that we put in at our distillery. And we were open-armed about it, like, hey man, if you guys want to come over and look at this thing, you're more than welcome. So we had teams of engineers, different people from other distilleries coming to us. And so even though we were kind of like, oh hell, you got your own distillery now, we were really showcasing it as, well, golly, think of how this is going to help us to help everybody. So it's really about kind of elevating everyone and using our distillery. And nobody was scared when we started Wilderness, because we were only at a 1 barrel a day operation. So our friends at, Maker's Mark or wherever, they're coming over like, no, we're not intimidated at all by this little contraption. Our still kind of was about the size of R2D2 whenever we started.
That's awesome. No, I wondered, so that's great. And it kind of goes in line with what you always hear in the industry, is that, when there's a fire, other places step up and provide their distillate or a place to store barrels, or, just that camaraderie within the industry, even though they're competitors, has just always blown my mind. And what you're saying goes right along, the lines of that same story. I feel like everyone says that in the industry, and to me, that's amazing. And I think that's a very unique thing, to be all in the same, vertical, if you will, or the same industry, and receive that type of help and almost like respect and just internal admiration for each other. I just think that's awesome. That's great that it was accepting like that.
Yeah, it's a great industry for sure.
Yeah. So let's go ahead and jump into the rye here. So the rye bourbon, I should say. Sorry, JD, not to get you excited.
The high rye bourbon.
We actually have a topic I want to talk about too after this.
Oh, good. Get you to start jumping into the conversation. So this one's 64% corn, 24% rye, and 12% malted barley, right?
Yep.
And is this also similar age? I know it's bottled in bond, so at least 4 years. Okay.
Yeah. If it doesn't have a 6+ year age statement on it, then it's going to be somewhere around that 4.5 to 5.5 year.
Okay.
A lot of vanilla.
Yeah, I've been nosing this. I got a ton of vanilla. It was almost like a spicy vanilla on the nose.
I'm getting like a vanilla fudge. There's like a fudge aspect to it.
Is that like from the texture or from the flavor? What do you mean?
Like a richness, decadent. Like it's a really decadent vanilla.
Yeah, I do get an interesting vanilla punch on the finish, which is not generally where I get vanilla. So that's kind of interesting to me, and I could see where you're maybe saying that from the vanilla fudge angle. That's kind of neat. I would have never thought of it on my own though. So I like that.
Well, were you guys, or you had mentioned the higher malt percentage and a lot of that chocolatiness. Sometimes that's kind of, you can pin that on the malt.
Yep. I love that. And it's funny that you talk about that, because one of the things that I love about a lot of the bourbons that I love, I should say, tend to be a little bit higher on the malted barley side. I feel like you'll still get that spiciness from the rye, but it almost kind of softens it. And like you said, gives it maybe like a smoother, chocolatey kind of note, if you will, or even if it's just a baking chocolate or something, there's some sort of chocolate type or malted chocolate type presence there when it's a higher malted barley for me. But it does, not that I need it to be softened up, but I feel like it does add like a rounded edge to, any of those things like spiciness or whatever that really gives you that, I don't know if it adds to the viscosity necessarily, but it just gives you a really interesting mouthfeel that I really tend to lean to.
Yeah. And there's a lot of different types of malt that's, that's kind of one thing that, when you talk about corn, most of the time you're talking about number 2 yellow dent corn, of which there are a lot of different varieties. Since we're tasting the high rye bourbon here, it's important to mention, the source of rye. That a lot of distillery, to my knowledge, when that rye was made, or that bourbon with rye in it was made, we were one of the only Kentucky distilleries, definitely that was on the Bourbon Trail, making whiskey with rye that was grown in Kentucky. So when you look at a lot of distilleries talk about, getting European rye and different, that's great quality rye. But I think it's important when you look at the regionality of some of that terroir of what you can get from a local rye versus a European rye, for example, or a rye that was grown more in the Midwest, outside of Kentucky.
Yeah, I think we pay attention to a lot of that stuff. I feel like one of our favorite distilleries here locally is Middle West Spirits. And they do a dark pumpernickel rye, which we really enjoy. Like, I'm not a huge rye whiskey person, but I like Michter's and I like the Middle West Spirits dark pumpernickel rye. I don't know that I've had Wilderness Trail rye, actually, so I can't really say anything about that. But I generally don't like the dilliness, if you will, that I get from ryes when it's, over 50% rye. It just tends to give me more of a dill flavor. But I do notice, I feel like, differences in the bourbons that are high rye bourbons and things like that. I really enjoy those a lot. And I feel like I notice almost like a different type of spiciness or a little bit of a different type of, baking spice or something that comes through with those when you're tasting those.
Yep.
So you don't like the dilly dilly commercials?
I love the dilly dilly commercials and I love dill pickles. I just don't like dill flavor in my whiskey. And I don't know if there's just something in my genetics that makes that come up. But whenever I taste, rye whiskeys, for the most part, not all of them, like I don't get it with Michter's very often and I don't get it with Middle West Spirits very often. But when that dill flavor really starts to elevate, I just, It's just not what I like in my whiskey generally.
Yeah, we often consider our rye as a gateway rye, because a lot of people that say they don't like rye, when they try ours, they end up liking rye. And I'll be honest with you, as I look at my kind of adventure to where I started and where I am now as a whiskey drinker, I didn't like rye to start with either. And I think it was because of the widespread terrible ryes that are out there. I mean, I'm just sorry to say it, but there's a lot of shitty rye out there. And if you just happen to get one as your first experience of rye, it's a damn good point to say, hell, I don't like rye either.
Yeah.
So, when you land on a really good one, and Wilderness Trail is a really good rye. Again, I look forward to hearing your thoughts on the rye whiskey. But it's just a really great product, and I don't know what it is about rye whiskeys that a lot of distilleries can't get right. I don't know if it's the grain percentages or what. Our rye has only 56% rye, 33% corn, which a lot of rye whiskeys don't have corn at all. Yeah. And then we have 11% malted barley. So it kind of more balances out like a bourbon recipe, but it's got the majority of rye in there.
I'd probably like that then, because I know, what is it? Is it Wild Turkey that's like 51% rye, or Old Forester or something? But
theirs is 51.
Yeah, so those I tend to be okay with, because for whatever reason, for me, it's usually two things: a lower entry point or a lower rye percentage in the mash bill, and
that's a good point. That's a good point, because I think you're right. I think Wild Turkey, Old Forester, they have, I think Old Forester is actually 55 rye and ours is 56. But still, those are two very different products. It's amazing how close the grain recipe is on those, but how different the flavor is. And so you got to really look at, golly, what is it? Is the sweet mash process? Is it the type of barrels? Which we use. When this whiskey was made, we used exclusively barrels that were called Cooper Select barrels. And in addition to a number 4 char, which is a little higher of a char level than most whiskeys go into, they were air dried for 18 to 24 months rather than the typical 3 to 6 months. Right. And that is the seasoning of the wood prior to construction of the barrel. And that makes a huge difference. The barrel manufacturers actually refer to that process as deacidification. And so you're volatilizing tannic acid as one of the main things that you're trying to kind of get rid of before the barrels are even constructed. And that means that you have less of a battle aging out that tannic acid before that whiskey, is less accurate to the taste. So that's something big time about our barrels. There's not too many Kentucky producers that go into barrels that were air dried for that long. So that's a huge difference.
So let me ask you this subject. Oh, sorry. Let me ask this, JD, and then I'll let you ask like 5 in a row, because so you talked about that, the tannins and maybe the extra seasoning of the wood, getting the acidity or the tannin, I think you said tannic acidity, I believe, out of the wood. Would that, and I know you said you've done some 10-year bottles, but some of the things that I've seen with like the ultra aged or ultra matured or whatever you want to call it, whiskeys, is sometimes that the tannins, that tannic, dryness or whatever, really tends to take over. Do you think that seasoning the wood for that extra period of time would help allow you to age it a little bit longer without introducing more of those tannins?
Well, in theory, that definitely is the case. I mean, you don't really know till you get to those older ages. But one thing I would, if nowadays, now that we have a more stratified program, we have barrels that are made today that we know aren't going to be open for 6 to 8 years. And in that case, we would be likely to save some money on the barrel and get one that just has a more standard air drying. But when we started Wilderness, we knew that we were going to wait till a bottle in bond, but we didn't want to wait like 6 or 8 years to release our first whiskey.
Sure.
So what we were trying to do is make it taste as delicious as it could possibly be at that 4.5 to 5.5 year period. And that's kind of was the decision to use the more air dried barrels, is so that it would taste better at the younger ages. Now, again, if you're going to let it go 6 to 8 years, you sort of outrun some of that tannic stuff anyway. And so you can go, and again, I'm not demeaning anyone who uses 3 to 6 month air dried barrels.
Sure.
But because if your goal is to go 6+ years, you can save money and go into the less air dried barrels. Yeah. So it's just one of the things that we did differently.
Well, I really like wheated bourbons, but I will say that the rye bourbon, it has, like you said, JD, has a really nice punch of vanilla, and it is a little bit of a more fudge is probably a great way to describe it. It's almost like a vanilla funk that gives me, like I bit into a piece of fudge. So that's actually really neat. But I'm really liking that vanilla presence in that rye is really nice.
Yeah. If I was going to get somebody a present of Wilderness Trail, and I didn't know what their level of enthusiasm was with whiskey, I'd get them the high rye bourbon every time, because it's just more of what you would expect in a really great bourbon. Whereas the weeder is something like, if I knew somebody was a little more nuanced and a little more, ready to kind of try some different things, the weeded is the way that I would go. I've probably historically drank more of the weeded than the high rye bourbon, but that's probably because the weeded has been out longer. I just haven't had time to catch up yet.
So JD, I know I cut you off a couple times, so go ahead with your questions, buddy.
No, that's okay. So on this particular single barrel, there's a sticker on the side, and it actually talks about the barrel that was used with it. And it's ISC, which I'm assuming is Independent Stave Company, right?
Yep.
And then it says MO. Now, you mentioned Cooper Select. What would that MO moniker stand for?
That stands for Missouri, and that's the only place that the Cooper Select barrels are made, is Missouri. And so whenever you look at the rivets on the side of a barrel that are holding the hoops together, that will have the initials where the state of where the barrel was made. And so that would be another place on that barrel where you would get to see where was that barrel made. And our barrels will say MO on those rivets because the barrels are actually made in Missouri. That's where they make those barrels.
Okay, cool. And now at a couple weeks ago at Dude's 50th birthday party, sorry I put your age out there. We were talking to our friend Jason, he's had you on his show before, Mash and Drum, and I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up. He wanted me to bring up the replication of yeast that you've been experimenting with, like trying to bring back old yeast strains. And replicate and reintroduce them. Have you attempted at bringing back the old Stitzel-Weller yeast strain?
Great question.
Well, for sure, we've attempted a lot of different things. Some of the things we've attempted didn't work, and some of them have. I would say there is now it's hard to say what was the old Stitzel-Weller strain because they're not running anymore. But
just like Heaven Hill, right?
Exactly. But when you look historically at how those distilleries progressed, and also nowadays we have a good handle on what everybody else is using. We know who's using the same strains, who's using different strains, et cetera, et cetera. At least in the state of Kentucky, we've got a lockdown on what is everybody using for 100% sure. I mean, all the way down to the nucleotide levels of the DNA, we understand what everyone is using. Now, when you say recreate an old strain, we're not sure that they're already still there. So it's not a far stretch of the imagination that similar strains are still being used today. We just don't have the data from the old production to compare it to. But based on what we see and all the diversity amongst the different distilleries, it's very possible, like greater than 50% chance, that more than one distillery is using the old Stitzel-Weller strain. And it's almost 100% sure that one of the strains that we use is very similar to the old Stitzel-Weller strain.
Interesting.
That's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
I mean, they're all the same species, so it's like, it's not like you're going outside to alien yeast. I mean, everybody's using the same species, and genetically, even if you look at the diversity among the yeast that are at the distilleries in Kentucky, they're very similar. Very similar.
How much would you say that the yeast plays a part in the flavor? I know when you go on a tour and you're at a distillery, they say, the barrel lends, what do they say, like 60? So I've heard a lot of different numbers, but like such a really high percentage of the flavor, which, I mean, I guess, the wood sugars and all that, it makes sense. But you go and you taste a line like Four Roses, for example, where they have, their different yeast strains. And each one of those is just unique. I mean, you do get like a unique flavor that's consistent, even with their varieties or their variances, I should say.
Yep.
But you do get a unique, consistent ballpark flavor profile from the different yeast recipes, it feels like. So, long-winded question: how long do you think, or how much do you think that actually plays a part in the flavor?
Well, the yeast makes 100% of all the alcohol. So take the alcohol away from bourbon, and what do you got left? Like wood flavored water. Right. So in my opinion, yeast are 100% responsible for all the flavor. But when you look at there's different stages, and when distilleries and breweries evaluate yeast strains, you can look at a yeast growing on a plate. I can smell the colonies and kind of get, that's got a bready, a yeasty. There are some different little smells you can get just with a yeast growing on a plate, not even associated with mash. Okay. Now I make a whole grain mash like I'm going to use to make bourbon, or I make a clear wort like I'm going to use to make beer. And I put that yeast in there and I let it ferment, and I'm going to get a product. Okay. And it's going to smell like something, and it's going to taste like something. And then I've switched the yeast strain, same thing. It's going to smell like something. It's going to taste like something. And that's where I start really seeing, holy crap, these are some huge differences. And if I'm a beer maker and somebody comes in there and starts saying that the yeast isn't important for flavor, you're going to get thrown out the door, because I don't know that you can have two different yeasts that even have a tiny bit of a difference, and you're going to be able to tell it in the flavor. It's that, but that's at the beer level.
Yeah,
now take that beer,
you introduce it to the wood, and that's
well, then distill it. Now
right.
Let's distill out the alcohol. Now I've concentrated all the alcohol down, and now I can still taste, oh wow, there's differences between these strains. I can't say that really one is better than the other, but they're differences.
Sure.
Now, if I'm making a decision about what yeast strain I want to use at that level, at either of those levels, I need to really think, well, man, if I'm putting this into a barrel, what is it going to do? Because there might be a flavor that doesn't taste that great in the distillate that is going to undergo chemical processes that is going to turn it into something great later in the barrel. So really, it's hard to evaluate for barrel-aged distilled spirits. But to the heart of your question, 100% sure, the different yeast have different effects. Now, most of the time, they're all going to make a quality spirit, okay? And so it's not about this one makes a terrible one, this one makes a great one. It's about this one makes a great one, and this one also makes a great one, but they're great in two different ways, Now, why the hell would we even switch yeast strains at all if it is less important? We're kind of taking the emphasis off of how important it is. But one of the things with the yeast that we switch is because of production factors like temperature. In the summer, we might want to run a yeast that's a little more temperature tolerant. So we're really not doing it for flavor. We're doing it because it runs better in a higher temperature. Or we might want a yeast that ferments in 2 days instead of 4 days. And that would be another, because if I have a distillery and I can ferment in 2 days, then I can reuse that tank 3.5 times in a week. If it takes a week to ferment, I got to occupy a tank for a whole week. So might have to buy 50 tanks instead of 10. So that gets into economics of distilling. How many tanks do I have to buy?
Right. That makes sense.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That's a lot of stuff about yeast that I just would have never thought of. That I know that everyone protects their yeast, everyone makes sure that their yeast line stays alive and all that stuff. But that's interesting. That's pretty neat to think about those other elements that come into play, or those externalities, or whatever you want to call them. But that's interesting.
Well, they used to try to protect their strains till we came along.
And started replicating. That's awesome. I know that it is almost 7:30. I don't know what your schedule is, so I want to be aware of your time. If we're not trying to go over like crazy or anything like that, but if you have,
no, I got a few more minutes.
So. Okay.
Yeah.
I do want to say I opened up this 6-year bottled and bond rye bourbon, and I'm kicking myself that I have not opened this up sooner, because I've had this for a while and I just had never gotten to it to open it, and I figured today was a great day for it. And just that additional, I don't know how old it actually is. Like, I'm sure it's batched with some things that are maybe 7 and some that are 6 or whatever, but this is outstanding. This is really good.
That would have been all barrels that would have been made within days of each other. So that batch for our 6-year high rye bourbon was only probably 4 or 5 barrel batch, small batches. So that would have been just a step away from a single barrel, really.
Well, and I know I bought this when it came. It says barreled 2014. I bought this, I think, when it very first came out. I don't know how many times you've released the 6-year, if you do it all the time now or not, but I remember when it first came out, there was a lot of talk about it, and I bought it right when that happened. So I'm guessing 2020, 2021, something like that. So I've had it for a minute.
And that would have been pot distilled.
Oh, really?
Guess it should say it on the label, on that bunch of rhetoric on that paragraph on the side. Does it say pot or column?
Yeah, copper pot distilled using 1 sweet mash process and aged for 6 years. Yep.
Nice.
That's cool. I was going to say,
mine's copper pot distilled too.
Pot, okay, yep. So those are old school.
Yeah, so I've got the single barrel rye whiskey, and it's 111 proof. And I'll tell you what, if I hadn't nosed a minty orange sorbet, I did now. I mean, it smells really nice.
That smells really good, actually, or it sounds really good, I should say.
Nice.
Yeah, there's something about pot distilling. I've always felt like it adds a little texture to the mouthfeel. I don't know why that is, and I'm sure you probably do, but I feel like anytime I've had pot distilled, it just adds like a texture to it. So I like that.
Yeah, you're cooking that stuff for hours, In a column, the beer only spends about 90, it tops 90 seconds in the column, and that's all the time that it gets exposed to the heat to remove the volatiles, whereas the beer is sitting in a pot still for 5 hours, and you're constantly increasing the temperature. As you lose alcohol, you got to keep increasing the temperature to get more and more out. And so that pulls over some more oils and different things that you don't get in a column still.
And that makes sense. Well,
Never
that's really cool.
Like
yeah, neither did I. Yeah. That's interesting. JD, did you have any more questions? I know I'm going to pour out a little bit of this Bourbon Enthusiast That's
Well, I'll just add, my favorite plant disease is curvularia.
Curvularia. Now that one is curvularia. Tell me which one is that is.
So it disguises itself as like a Pythium blight.
Yep.
But it identifies itself because it forms in like half circles.
Now is that on turf grass?
Yeah, that's turf grass. I work at a golf course, and so I've got to study dollar spot and red thread and all that kind of stuff all the time.
Got it.
I had the pleasure of dealing with Rick Buckley at Rutgers.
Oh, okay. Nice. I had a kind of a famous moment as a graduate student. I was working with gray leaf spot on perennial ryegrass. And this was in the mid 90s when every fairway in the United States almost had perennial rye on it. And mid 90s, it was either perennial rye or you'd have like Bermuda grass. And a lot of the golf courses in Kentucky had perennial rye. And we got devastated by gray leaf spot one year. And that was the year that we were doing our fungicide trials. And so only damn thing that was green on that course was a couple squares with like Heritage or one of those, whatever fungicide it was that worked really good against gray leaf spot. It was like, holy shit, man. You know, sometimes you're kind of scratching your head. Does this really work? But when you've got disease pressure like that, it's like, man, it's either dead or alive. Those are the two choices.
Oh, yeah. Fluazidam and chlorothalonil are our friend.
Yeah, that's right. I've probably breathed in enough of that crap. I had it in my hair and everything else.
All right, so we're trying not to lose listeners, JD. So I'm going to bring it back to the whiskey a little bit. No, that's pretty awesome that you guys get a chance to nerd out a little bit. So I know that we're coming up on time a little bit. Obviously, you've got wildernesstraildistillery.com. Social media presences, also any interesting things coming out soon, any announcements or anything like that you want people to be aware of?
You know, I need to get better at that. I know we probably do have a lot of important stuff coming up, but I can't think of anything. Will we see a 10-year
Wilderness Trail product?
Yeah, we've already released a 10-year, and just as we get into more aged barrels, you know, expect to see that more widespread. So for sure, you know, I think we've got a total of 3 10-year barrels aging on site right now. So there's, you know, little by little, but that was a year where we made like 200 barrels, and you know, we laid back I think 21,000 starting like 3 years ago. So, you know, we're getting into more and more inventory as we go along.
So is your goal long term to get to 12, 15, or is there a sweet spot that you think you want to just get to and not go past, or what's the long term?
Well, what would be the fun of that? You got to get to the old hell. We want to get to 100 year, you know, at some point, if there's any left in the barrel.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we've always been highly intrigued about getting to an old age statement. I mean, I want some damn Wilderness Trail weeder right next to the Weller 12, and everybody saying, forget about that shit. I'm going to buy Wilderness from now on.
Yeah.
You know, we're highly interested in that. And especially when you look at a lot of the real old stuff is 90 proof, you know, you just don't, and you know, we're pushing the limits here. You know, we want to put pressure on everybody and, you know, kind of play this game like you would want to play it if you're the biggest bourbon fan on the world and you were lucky enough to have a distillery. And how would you do it? You know, we're doing it that way.
I mean, that tracks with what you said at the beginning. You chose sweet mash because it sounded tougher. So right there, you're challenging the industry. I like it. Staying consistent. I think that's a good place to land the plane too. It brings us back full circle. So I want to thank you, thank Kara for setting this up, but I want to thank you for coming on. I know that you're busy. You were on another call consulting before this one, and who knows what you're doing after this, but really appreciate your time. It was really enjoyable talking to you, and I'm sure JD can say the same. Got a chance to nerd out with you on some microbiology type stuff.
Little Pink Floyd action at
Pink Floyd,
Ohio State.
Guma.
Little curvularia.
I mean, when have those two things ever been mentioned in the same conversation? So, but I want to say cheers. This is a great product. I feel like everyone by now is, if they're into bourbon, has tried Wilderness Trail, but if you haven't, you're definitely missing out. So make sure you pick something up, whether you like wheat or rye bourbon or rye whiskey. Pick something up because they're doing it the right way. So cheers. Thank you, Pat, for coming on, and best of luck to you. Hope we can talk to you soon.
Thanks for having me on, guys.
Appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for joining us on yet another Hunt for Bourbon. Please give us a 5-star review anywhere you are listening, but if you don't, leave some constructive criticism in the review so that we can better improve our show. But until then, sit back, grab a pour, kick up your feet, and enjoy some bourbon. The Bourbon Hunters podcast has been craft distilled, produced, recorded, and edited by Dude Pool. For any questions, comments, or recommendations, please reach out to info@bourbonhunters.com.